Read by Carlos Osuita for Ian Iamroti. Ian Lamroti. Let's talk about your points. One, media was not the same in the 60s and 70s. Two, people were not polarized like today. Three, the hate. Four, you have generals out there split. Five, corporate involvement in politics. Six, social media. Okay, one, I'd say that the media was much worse in the 1960s and 1970s. There was much more power concentrated in much fewer hands. For example, the US and South Vietnam literally wiped out the offensive capabilities of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the Tet Offensive, but that was when Walter Cronkite, a closeted radical leftist, lied and said that we could not win the war. And millions of Americans believed him. The press controlled geopolitics. Two, people were far more polarized in the 1960s and 1970s than they are today. After all, we had a huge number of domestic terrorists operating with massive public support. It was in the 60s that we adopted the Great Society policies that re-enslaved Black Americans. Three, the hate was worse in the 1960s and 70s. We had political assassinations, Jim Crow laws that existed until 1965, and the peak of domestic terrorism. Americans were the main source of money and weapons for the Irish Republican Army. As late as 1978, there were more than 100 terrorist attacks a year in the US. All of it was based on politics, the politics of hate. Four, we've always had politicized generals and admirals. It's simply the nature of the beast. There was never a period of political unity among our military leaders. This is why so many of them are mediocre. A man like Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher comes along only rarely. In World War II, he won the Battle of Midway, an impossible job that he did without complaint. By sinking all 4 Japanese carriers, he made the outcome of the war a foregone conclusion. The fighting went on for 2 more years, but the Japanese were strategically defeated. Fletcher won the Medal of Honor in 1914 by first volunteering to evacuate refugees in an unarmed transport while under heavy fire, and then volunteering to drive a train down a mined track to rescue more refugees. He was a real weirdo, the good kind. Fletcher is the only flag or general officer to ever refuse to participate in the official history of a war. He would not be interviewed about the Battle of Midway because he said his own actions were unimportant compared to the actions of his subordinates. Most of our senior officers have been self-centered incompetents. We win wars despite them, not because of them. The modern corporate involvement in politics began in the 1970s. And in the 1960s, you had corrupt labor unions running the show. If corporations ran the show, they'd have no taxes, no environmental regulations, no hiring requirements or restrictions, and child labor. In the 1960s, there were almost no environmental regulations. The EPA was formed in 1970. Before 1968, there were no mandatory seatbelts in cars. You should get on your knees to corporations for revolutionizing how we fight pandemics. Trump works with corporations, and as a result, we're doing things at a speed never before possible. Here's how government works. Politicians create laws in order to extort money from corporations. Trump is waiving regulations in order to stop corruption. When politicians no longer have the power to extort, corporations can't buy the politicians. Idiots like Susan Rice complained that Trump didn't do an Obama and micromanage the response to the pandemic. Obama had a reverse Midas touch because government is his religion. Remember the Kuwait oil fires? All the experts predicted that it would take 10 years to put them out. Why? The Iraqis dynamited the wellheads, so that meant the wellhead had to be cut off and replaced with a new one. The only way to cut off a flaming wellhead, a giant blowtorch, was to use two flame-proof tracked vehicles that put a diamond-encrusted steel cable around the wellhead and pulled it back and forth, back and forth. It took 2 days to cut off one wellhead. Then it took another day to cap the wellhead. Well, there was a company that had invented a new technology, a steam cutter that cut off the wellhead in under an hour. That company had planned on selling the technology for billions. Instead, it gave it away. The Kuwait oil fires were put out in 10 months, not 10 years. The company that invented the steam cutter and gave it away, losing billions, is named Halliburton. People who hate corporations are dumber than piles of sawdust. 6, social media has no real impact on politics. If it did, the Republicans would not be crushing the Democrats in special elections that Democrats were supposed to win. People think social media is the real world. That makes them easy to fool. Social media lets Trump pull off his massive strategic deceptions. People addicted to social media are as easily manipulated as children. They don't know how anything works, and they don't know any history. They're sitting ducks for Trump. Everything is far more stable now than in the 1960s and 70s. Yes, if Biden were to be elected, we'd lose everything due to the recent Supreme Court ruling on DACA. But the corollary is that when Trump and the GOP win, that's game, set, match. From the 1960s until today, we let leftism get this far. In a democratic, representative republic, the people get the government they deserve. But by their very nature, leftists are too immature to succeed. They refuse to learn about things that they consider dirty. They hate Trump, so they wish upon a star, and then they lose. They're dolts. Trump has been preparing for almost as long as the 60s radicals. By the end of his second term, things will be set in concrete. That's why we're seeing leftists going berserk. They know that this is the end. Has any real noose ever been left anywhere? Why leave a Barbie-sized noose for a big strapping fella? Did Nigerian Klansmen leave it? Did they also leave behind bleach? I'm almost 58 years old and I have a really good memory. Don't try to tell me that today is worse than anything that came before us. I saw this happen on live TV, the 1972 Democrat convention, I'm assuming. And then, of course, I saw this happen on live TV, the 1975 President Ford assassination attempt. And of course, I saw this happen on live TV. And I'm going to pull that up. Anatomy of an Assassination Attempt from Time.com. Link in the description. The assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. You guys bitch about boomers. We live through stuff you little kids can't imagine. Try finding meaning when you're told that a nuclear war is inevitable. We still had the draft. I was 13 when the last draftee war ended. When you've never experienced real trauma and you're a drama queen, you think a stubbed toe is as bad as losing your whole leg. Grow up.